This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com. This year, ArtTactic is celebrating 25 years of trusted art market insight, backed by rigorous analysis and independent research. To learn more about all of our products, visit ArtTactic.com. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was great seeing so many of you in New York last week. The city was full of art fairs, gallery openings, and auctions. Perhaps the most talked about aspect of the week, though, was the major New York May auctions, where in the end more than $2 billion worth of art was sold. Reading the headlines, you could easily come away with the impression that the entire art market is booming again. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think this season was a clear reminder that when a large volume of exceptional estates and collections comes to the market, there's still incredible demand at the highest level. And perhaps the biggest lesson from the season is that quality remains incredibly important. In particular, in a more selective market, great works still attract attention, demand, competition, and ultimately strong prices. To help us make sense of last week's auction results, in this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Judd Tully, independent art journalist. You can find all of his coverage on his website, juddtully.net. He covered the sales this last week for the art newspaper. If you haven't checked out his coverage there, we definitely recommend you do. Hope you enjoy our conversation with Judd. Thanks so much for listening. Judd, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Adam.
Absolutely. It's always great chatting with you. So the major May New York auctions just concluded, and I think this season was really defined by the significant number of prominent estates and really historically important works that came to auction. Before we even dive into the details, how would you say overall the sales went?
Well, overall, they went swimmingly well. Some historic prices, especially with the Robert Manouchian single owner sale at Sotheby's and the S.I. Newhouse sale that was at Christie's, the so-called masterpieces from the collection of the Condé Nast publisher and longtime art collector, stood out in the sense that they were both, at least in the art world, well-known figures, just as Aggie Gund, who was the former president of the Board of Trustees at MoMA, a great philanthropist and activist, I believe really helped the outcomes and the way the houses marketed everything. Almost to a kind of absurd degree, which I'm sure you've heard about, the Brancusi head at Christie's, and the Christie's had put together Nicole Kidman kind of prancing around the sculpture and having this kind of flashy, kind of almost like a dance with this head, which I don't know if that added or subtracted to anything. I would say certainly if you wanted to stand out picture of the season would be the Jackson Pollock 20-foot wide drip painting that I think it hammered at something like 157 million before fees. And just to give it like a little indication of when it got serious between two bidders, both on the telephone at around, I think it was something like 107 million. They just went up in $1 million increments for what seemed like forever. I think the whole thing took maybe 7 minutes. So I guess the lesson learned, if there's anything to learn, is that there are super wealthy people out there. And when a masterpiece rare to market appears, there seems to be records making possibilities, which certainly happened with the Pollock. And the backstories are also great, like the Aggie Gund's Mark Rothko painting that she acquired directly from the artist during a studio visit when she was in her 20s, and remarkably, and had gone with Emily Tremaine, who at the time was a very well known art collector. And Aggie Gunn bought this painting. She actually, according to whatever the story goes, there was another painting that she picked, and Rothko urged her to get the one that made a record price this time around. So all those stories are, they're great. I mean, there's something other than, a number. This was in the catalog raisonné, or this was in the X retrospective. They're all had, actually, interestingly, the Aggie Gunn picture had only been exhibited in public once before, I think in the 1980s at the Cleveland something museum with works from Cleveland collectors.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I noticed that as well, actually, when the catalogs came out. I couldn't believe that it had only been exhibited once publicly, which was really surprising because normally these types of works, these masterpieces that sell for such extraordinary amounts, are generally included in the majority, if not all, of the artist's exhibitions over decades' time. So it's very rare, I think, for a work to sell for that much that's only been in one exhibition.
Exactly. It might have also shown how much she adored the painting and how close she kept uh, in her own place and lived with it for many years.
Yeah, I suppose that could have been the case. So I think this season, and we've touched on it a little bit already, but this season was really defined by the fact that there were so many extraordinary works and so many incredible collections, and a lot of these works performed very well. And this is happening during a period of uncertainty and even softness in the art market. How do you think we should interpret the fact that these really excellent masterpieces did so well in this current market climate? Do you think the results suggest something about the broader market, or is this a case of just a more exceptional season that ultimately was anchored by these phenomenal estates with just outstanding works, and that high quality works always sell well, no matter what the climate is?
Yeah, I would say that the names, the estates, the quality of the works, but you have to understand, obviously you understand, that all of these trophy works virtually were backed by either third-party guarantees or some combination with house guarantees, meaning that Christie's or Sotheby's would be part of that financial insurance package, where most likely those works would not appear at auction without them because of the danger of them not selling or not making the price that the consigners wanted. And again, when you have an estate situation, which was the case with examples that we've mentioned so far, Mnuchin and Aggie Gund and S.I. Newhouse, for estate purposes, they needed to sell. So it's very, a super effect, super impact. But then again, it was also a kind of pretty much, you might say, a done deal. And I'm sure if you're not looking at the symbols next to the catalog that would designate whether something did have a financial backing and you didn't read the fine print, your jaw would drop. And the other thing that I noticed, and I think it's been going on for a while, and it kind of leads into what you were saying about somewhat of a softer market in the recent past, but especially, I believe, for younger artists. Sotheby's actually combined what they refer to as the now portion of their evening sale with contemporary kind of mixed in, because they've definitely stepped back in terms of showing younger cutting edge artists that I think the taste now, or I don't know if it's taste exactly, but it has something to do with investment purposes, that it's a more conservative climate And when you think about it, I mean, Mark Rothko, Konstantin Brancusi, Mondrian, Jackson Pollock. I mean, these are classic museum-clad artists, no question about it. And so you might, I don't know, I wouldn't use the word speculate, but it seems, there's less hunger for speculative works.
Yeah, and I think if you do have a work by one of these more speculative artists and you were thinking about selling it, perhaps maybe you're more inclined to hold on to it and not sell it in this climate where there's a level of uncertainty about how these types of artists may perform and if they'll achieve the high prices that they were achieving over the past few years.
I mean, what I thought was you can't predict, when some important collector is going to pop off or something would come to market. I think the auction houses were very much aware that given the, geopolitical climate, just the kind of crazy world we're living in, that they really pushed on the rarity of these things and the kind of idea that actually people talked about. This is 100 years ago now, but in terms of post 9/11, where people were more concerned with being at home, being surrounded, hopefully, by beautiful objects, and that it was a kind of psychological comfort to invest in this kind of thing. And they are obviously investments.
And you've touched on guarantees here a little bit, and you did note in your recaps in the art newspaper that the majority of works were backed by guarantees. What exactly do you make of that? And ultimately, what does it signify actually about maybe certain aspects of the art market at the moment?
It shows that it's a necessary part of the art market machine. It's been going on for a number of years, although what used to be classically the auction houses would, on their own, finance these guarantees. And then in 2008, 2009, all the auction houses lost millions on bets they had made 6 months before when they made these deals. And so then everything, not everything, but there was a big switch towards third party, or what Sotheby's loves to call irrevocable bids, which sounds almost like a prison sentence or something. It's just part of the infrastructure now. And you don't even know because the third parties, they're anonymous. So you have no idea, looking at it from the outside, who these people are, exactly what kind of margins they're getting, if they're getting pieces of the buyer's premium. It's a mix. And they have a financial fee, but they're not disclosed what they are.
And so outside of some of the trophy pieces that we've already discussed, I'm curious, what were some of the major artwork storylines that people were following most closely, perhaps leading up to the sales, and which works ultimately became the biggest talking points afterwards?
One amazing result, it wasn't in the tens of millions, but it was a portrait that sold by Alice Neal. It was a mother and child, and it was of her daughter-in-law and granddaughter. And it was a figurative painting, and it made a record 5.6 million. And I think it's again, the subject matter, kind of the feel-good, emotional, mother and child kind of subject, almost as, the Impressionists would have painted, but with Alice Neal's edgy figurative work. I think that was certainly a standout.
Yeah, that was actually one that I was bidding on for a client, but came up a little bit short. And I think it kind of shows that no matter what market we're in, a really high quality example is going to sell well. And that Alice Neal, I think it was her best painting ever to come to auction. It was in nearly every exhibition she's been in. I mean, the exhibition history was somewhat laughable. It was so lengthy. It was the cover of her Whitney show in the 70s. It was just a really fantastic example. And I didn't think it would go that high, but I definitely thought it was worthy of being her auction record.
Sure. And maybe another, I mean, it was interesting because both houses had major works by Miro, and the one that made the record was his portrait of Madame K, which was a surrealist period painting. When you look at it, it's kind of a diagrammatic, but somehow very sensual, almost erotic looking painting of one of his friends. And that made a record, it was like 53.5 million. Again, it's kind of an old saw about rarity. The Oliver Barker at Sotheby's would possibly say, you'll never get another chance at something like this. I'm not quoting him, but that's usually how, they try to egg on potential bidders. Can this kind of gush of, records of money, Christie's doing over $1 billion in a single evening, can that happen again? I mean, it just depends what will come next. I would think that on the basis of this past season, that 6 months from now, there might be incentives to put valuable works up again. But again, you just don't know. But certainly this season, it's a benchmark, but you can't kind of just repeat it every few months. So I don't know if the sales coming up in London will carry over from the energy in New York. It's hard to say.
Yeah, well, that's actually what I wanted to ask you about before we let you go. Coming out of these May New York auctions, how would you describe the mood of the market? Because we're about to head into some very major events. We have Art Basel in Switzerland and then the London auctions.
Going into London, I don't know. It's just the world is so topsy-turvy. It seems incredible that this kind of result could happen. It's almost like separate worlds, separate planets almost. And you can't also take away from just the enormous wealth that's been created and recently with, more and more billionaires and who can afford trophies.
Yeah, well, it'll be really interesting to see how the next month and a half plays out. Judd, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us recap the major May New York auctions. So many incredible storylines this season. And if our listeners haven't already, they should definitely check out your coverage in the art newspaper, as well as all of your writing on your website, juddtully.net. And you're also on Instagram. Where can we find you there?
On Instagram, Judd Tully. I did a video for White Cube on their current exhibition of David Hammonds and Yanis Kunelis, and that's on their social media platforms.
We'll definitely have to check it out. That was an incredible show. Judd, thanks so much again.
Thanks, Adam.